Before we begin, if you love stories of redemption and fated bonds, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Drop a comment telling me which pack member you connect with most. Now let's dive into a story that will leave you breathless. The rope creaked against the ancient oak branch, a sound so faint it might have been mistaken for wind through winter leaves. But Cade's wolf knew better, because every instinct in his massive body screamed that something was terribly, devastatingly wrong. He had been running the northern perimeter when the scent hit him. That delicate combination of moonflower and rain that belonged to only one person in the entire Shadowpine territory. And beneath it lay something metallic and sharp that made his beast surge forward with a violence he hadn't felt since the day he lost his first mate to rival claws. The forest blurred past him as his paws thundered against frozen ground, his heart hammering a rhythm of pure terror because that scent was fading, growing thinner with each second, and he knew with absolute certainty that if he didn't reach her in time, the fragile thread connecting them would snap forever. When he burst through the clearing, his massive wolf form skidded to a halt, and what he saw turned his blood to ice in his veins. Sarah hung from the old hanging tree, the one the pack used for executions of traitors, her small body suspended in the bitter air like a broken doll, her face pale as moonlight, and her lips already turning blue. The rope around her neck was crude, hastily tied, and her hands hung limp at her sides. No signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, just the terrible stillness of someone who had given up fighting. Cade shifted before his paws even stopped moving. His transformation so violent it sent shockwaves through the ground, and he was running again in human form, his voice ripping from his throat in a roar that shook snow from every branch in the clearing. He reached her in 3 strides, his hands catching her waist and lifting her body to release the pressure on her neck. And the moment he touched her skin, he felt how cold she was, how her wolf had retreated so deep inside her that he could barely sense its presence. His claws extended on instinct, and he sliced through the rope with one savage motion, cradling her against his chest as they both fell to the frozen ground, and for one heart-stopping moment, she didn't breathe. Cade pressed his ear to her chest, his hands trembling as they cradled her head, and when he finally heard the faint flutter of her heartbeat, something inside him broke and reformed simultaneously, because he had almost lost her, almost let her slip away without ever knowing the truth. He tilted her head back, his fingers gentle despite their size, and breathed for her, forcing air into her lungs with desperate precision, his wolf howling inside his mind with a grief so profound it felt like dying. Once, twice, 3 times he breathed life back into her, and on the 4th breath she gasped, her body convulsing as oxygen flooded back into her starved system, and her eyes flew open, wide and terrified and completely disoriented. She tried to pull away from him, her survival instinct kicking in even though she could barely move. But Cade held her firmly, his massive arms creating a shelter around her trembling form. And he spoke her name like a prayer, over and over, until the panic in her eyes began to fade into recognition. Sarah's first conscious thought was that she had failed, that even this final act of escape had been taken from her, and the realization brought tears spilling down her temples as Cade's face swam into focus above her. She wanted to ask him why he bothered, why he had saved someone the pack considered worthless, someone his chosen mate had declared Omega scum unfit to breathe the same air as true wolves. But her throat was too damaged, and all that came out was a broken, rasping sound that made his expression twist with something that looked almost like agony. His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing away her tears with a tenderness that contradicted everything she thought she knew about the brutal Alpha King of Shadowpine. And when he spoke, his voice was raw with emotion she had never heard from him before. He told her she was safe now, that he had her, that nothing would hurt her again. But the words felt like lies because she had heard the same promises before, whispered in darkness before dawn turned them to ash. And she knew that safety was an illusion for someone like her. Cade lifted her into his arms as if she weighed nothing, her body curling instinctively against his chest. And he began walking back toward the pack house, his steps measured and careful, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of who had done this. The rage building inside him was a living thing, a beast that demanded blood and retribution, because someone in his pack had taken his Omega, his fated mate that he had denied for 2 years out of political obligation and stupidity, and strung her up like common prey. His wolf demanded he lay waste to everyone who had ever hurt her, that he paint the snow red with the blood of those who had made her feel so worthless that death seemed like mercy. But right now, holding her broken body against his, all he could focus on was keeping her alive. She shivered violently despite his body heat, her fingers clutching weakly at his shirt, and he knew she was going into shock, her system overwhelmed by trauma and oxygen deprivation. So he pushed more of his alpha energy into her, willing his strength to become hers, his warmth to chase away the cold death that had nearly claimed her. The pack house loomed ahead through the trees, its windows glowing with light that seemed obscene given what had just happened, and Cade's lips pulled back from his teeth as he caught sight of movement on the front steps. Thalia stood there, his chosen mate, his political alliance wrapped in beauty and ambition, her arms crossed, and her expression one of cold satisfaction that confirmed every suspicion exploding through his mind. She had orchestrated this, had finally decided to eliminate the competition she claimed didn't exist, and the fact that she stood there so brazenly, so confident in her position, made Cade's wolf surge forward with violence barely contained. He adjusted Sarah in his arms, making sure she was secure against his chest, and then he met Thalia's eyes with a look that promised devastation, because she had just made the biggest mistake of her life, and there would be no forgiveness, no second chances, only justice delivered with the full weight of his alpha authority. Thalia's smile faltered when she saw Sarah breathing, when she realized her carefully laid plan had failed spectacularly, but she recovered quickly, her chin lifting in defiance as Cade climbed the steps with his precious burden. She started to speak, to offer some excuse about pack law and Omega weakness, but Cade's growl cut her off mid-sentence, a sound so deep and threatening that every wolf within hearing distance froze in submission. He didn't stop, didn't slow, just carried Sarah straight through the front door and up the stairs toward his private chambers, leaving Thalia standing alone on the steps with her mouth still open, her power crumbling around her as the pack began to understand what they were witnessing. The Alpha King, who had rejected his fated mate for political gain, who had allowed his chosen to torment and abuse the Omega Girl for 2 years, was finally choosing his true bond, and the ramifications would reshape their entire world. Inside his chambers, Cade laid Sarah on his bed with infinite care, his hands checking her pulse, examining the rope burns around her neck, cataloging every injury with clinical precision, even as his heart shattered at each new discovery. Her wrists bore bruises shaped like fingers, evidence that someone had held her while another tied the noose, and her body was covered in older marks, scars and welts that spoke of systematic abuse that had happened right under his nose while he pretended not to see. The guilt was crushing, a physical weight pressing down on his chest until he could barely breathe, because he had known, somewhere deep inside, he had always known what was happening to her. But he had chosen his duty over his heart, his pack's political stability over the safety of his mate, and now she had nearly paid the ultimate price for his cowardice. He pulled a blanket over her shaking form, then moved to the fireplace, building the flames higher until the room was almost uncomfortably warm, because she needed heat, needed comfort, needed everything he had failed to give her for 2 years. Sarah watched him through half-closed eyes, her mind struggling to make sense of what was happening, because this didn't fit any pattern she understood about Cade or their relationship. He had rejected her publicly when their bond snapped into place at her 18th birthday, had declared her too weak to be his Luna, too common to stand at his side, and for 2 years she had endured that rejection while watching him with Thalia, watching him pretend the mate bond didn't exist while it slowly killed them both. She had tried to leave, had begged the moon goddess for death 100 times before finally deciding to take matters into her own hands. But even that choice had been stolen from her when Thalia's followers dragged her from her room in the middle of the night. They had laughed while they tied the rope, had told her she was doing everyone a favor by disappearing, that even the Alpha King would thank them for removing such an embarrassment from his territory. And she had believed them, had felt relief mixed with her terror because at least the pain would finally end. Cade returned to her side with warm water and soft cloths, his movements gentle as he began, cleaning the dried blood from her neck, and when she flinched, His entire body went rigid with barely controlled fury. He forced himself to breathe, to gentle his touch even more, and began speaking to her in a low, steady voice that seemed designed to anchor her to the present moment. He told her things he should have said 2 years ago, confessions that poured out of him like poison being drawn from a wound, admitting that he had been a coward, that he had chosen political convenience over the gift the moon goddess had given him, that every day without her as his true mate had been agony, he convinced himself was duty. His hands shook as he traced the rope burns with healing energy, his alpha power flowing into her damaged tissue, knitting torn cells back together with warmth that felt like sunlight after endless winter. She wanted to tell him it was too late, that words meant nothing after 2 years of deliberate cruelty, but her voice still wouldn't work properly. So she just watched him with eyes that held too much pain for someone barely 20 years old. The door to his chambers crashed open, and Marcus, his beta and childhood friend, stood in the doorway with blood splattered across his face and rage burning in his eyes. He looked at Sarah lying in the Alpha's bed, at the rope burns around her neck, at the careful way Cade was tending to her, and his expression shifted from fury to understanding in the span of a heartbeat. He had been the one who found the 3 wolves responsible, had tracked their scents back to the hanging tree, and then to Thalia's private quarters, and what he had learned made him want to tear the pack apart with his bare hands. He told Cade everything in short, brutal sentences, how Thalia had ordered the execution, how she had promised rewards to those who carried it out, how she had planned to blame it on rogues and use the tragedy to finally solidify her position as undisputed Luna. The beta's voice cracked when he described finding the rope in Thalia's closet. The same rope that had been around Sarah's neck, coiled carefully and hidden beneath silk dresses like a trophy waiting to be claimed. Cade's reaction was volcanic and terrifying, his alpha power exploding outward in a wave that rattled windows and sent cracks spiderwebbing through the stone walls. But he didn't move from Sarah's side, didn't let his rage pull him away from the fragile girl who needed him more than vengeance did. He issued orders in a voice that promised death, commanding Marcus to secure Thalia and her accomplices in the cells beneath the pack house, to gather the Council of Elders for an emergency tribunal, to send word to every allied pack that the Shadowpine Alpha King was invoking ancient law for crimes against a fated mate. The beta nodded once, his eyes flicking to Sarah with something like apology or perhaps recognition, and then he was gone, leaving them alone again in the firelit chamber that had become both sanctuary and confession booth. Cade returned his attention to Sarah, his hand finding hers beneath the blanket, and this time when their skin touched, he didn't hide the bond, didn't suppress the golden thread that connected their souls, just let it flare to life between them with intensity that made them both gasp. Sarah felt the bond open fully for the first time, felt Cade's emotions flooding into her consciousness without filter or barrier, and the tsunami of guilt and love and desperate fear nearly overwhelmed her already fractured mind. She could feel how much he had suffered during their separation, how the rejection had been killing him slowly, even as he convinced himself it was necessary. How every time Thalia touched him it felt like betrayal of the worst kind because his wolf recognized only one mate. She could feel his horror at what had almost happened, his rage at those responsible, his determination to spend the rest of his life making amends for the 2 years he had wasted. And beneath it all, pulsing like a heartbeat, was love so profound and consuming that it made her own heart stutter in response. Tears spilled down her cheeks again, but these were different, complicated and painful and somehow healing all at once. Because even though words meant nothing, the bond never lied, and she could feel his truth reverberating through every cell of her being. Cade climbed onto the bed beside her, pulling her carefully into his arms, arranging her body against his chest so that she could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong and alive. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in her scent like a drowning man finally reaching air, and his voice was barely a whisper when he spoke against her temple. He told her he loved her, had loved her from the moment their eyes met across the gathering circle 2 years ago, that the bond had snapped into place with such force it had driven him to his knees. But he had been too young and too stupid and too concerned with pack politics to recognize the gift for what it was. He confessed that every day since the rejection had been torture, that his wolf had nearly driven him mad with the need to claim her, to protect her, to erase every moment of pain he had caused. But pride and duty had kept him chained to a decision that was destroying them both. His arms tightened around her, careful of her injuries but desperate for contact. And he swore on his life and his title and his very soul that he would never let anyone hurt her again, that she was his Luna in truth now and forever, that anyone who challenged that would face his wrath. Sarah's damaged throat finally produced sound, a whisper so soft he had to strain to hear it. But when her words registered, they hit him harder than any physical blow could have. She asked him why she should believe him now, why his promises meant anything when he had broken her so completely over the past 2 years, why she should trust that this wasn't just guilt or obligation talking, temporary feelings that would fade once the drama passed and political considerations reasserted themselves. Her questions were fair and devastating, each one a knife between his ribs. And Cade had no good answers because she was right to doubt him, right to protect herself from more pain, right to question whether his sudden change of heart was genuine or just another form of cruelty. All he could offer was the truth flowing through their bond, the inescapable reality that his wolf had chosen her and would never choose another, that fated mates were sacred and eternal and beyond the realm of politics or convenience. But he knew that understanding intellectually was different from believing it in your shattered heart. The night deepened around them, and slowly, gradually, Sarah's shaking subsided as Cade's warmth and the bond's reassurance began to penetrate her shock. She drifted in and out of consciousness, her body demanding rest to heal, and each time she woke, he was there, his hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring words of comfort and protection, his presence solid and unwavering. At some point, food appeared, brought by Omega servants who stared at Sarah with wonder and relief, as if her survival was somehow miraculous, and Cade fed her small bites with infinite patience, coaxing her to take nourishment even when she wanted to refuse. He bathed her wounds again, applied healing salves that smelled of mountain herbs and magic, wrapped her throat in soft bandages that would help the damaged tissue regenerate. And through it all, he kept up a steady stream of words, telling her pack history, sharing memories of his childhood, painting pictures of the future he wanted to build with her by his side. Dawn was breaking when the Council of Elders finally assembled, their ancient faces grave as they climbed the stairs to the Alpha's chambers, because the charges against Thalia were severe, and the evidence was damning, and the punishment would need to be swift and public. Cade had dressed while Sarah slept, his formal Alpha regalia making him look every inch the warrior king his bloodline demanded. But he refused to leave her side, conducting the tribunal from his chambers with her sleeping form visible in his bed. The elders entered with proper deference, their eyes widening when they saw the rope burns on Sarah's neck, the bruises on her wrists, the undeniable evidence of attempted murder against a fated mate, and their expressions hardened into something ancient and unforgiving. Thalia was dragged in by Marcus and 2 other warriors, her hands bound in silver that burned her skin, her face no longer beautiful but twisted with hatred and desperation. And when she saw Sarah alive in the Alpha's bed, something vicious flared in her eyes before fear replaced it. The trial was short and brutal, the evidence overwhelming and the witnesses plentiful, because Thalia's accomplices had broken under interrogation and confessed everything in desperate attempts to save themselves from the full weight of Alpha justice. They described how Thalia had been planning Sarah's death for months, how she had tried poison first, but Sarah's Omega constitution had fought it off, how she had arranged accidents that Sarah somehow survived through pure luck or perhaps divine intervention, and finally how she had ordered the hanging, convinced that if she framed it as suicide, the pack would simply move on without questions. One of the elders, a woman so old her hair was pure white as snow, stood and pronounced judgment in a voice that carried the weight of centuries, declaring that Thalia had violated sacred law by attempting to murder a fated mate, that her crimes warranted death under ancient pack code, but that the Alpha King would have final say as was his right and duty. Cade stood, his presence filling the room with power that made everyone except Sarah drop their eyes in automatic submission, and when he spoke, his voice was cold as winter death and twice as final. He stripped Thalia of her chosen mate status, declared the political alliance with her family null and void, and sentenced her to banishment, exile from every Pact territory in the Northern Hemisphere, marked as rogue and outcast with no protection and no home. It was a mercy she didn't deserve, but he gave it anyway. Not for her sake, but because he was done with death and cruelty and politics built on suffering. And he wanted to start his reign as true alpha with justice tempered by mercy. Thalia screamed as they dragged her away, curses and threats pouring from her mouth until someone gagged her. And the last anyone saw of her was her wolf form fleeing into the forest, with blood-red dawn painting the sky behind her like judgment made manifest. When the chamber finally emptied and silence returned, Cade stripped off his formal clothes and climbed back into bed with Sarah, pulling her against him with desperate gentleness, and for the first time in 2 years he let himself cry. Great, shuddering sobs that racked his massive frame, tears for the time they had lost, for the pain he had caused, for how close he had come to losing her forever before they even had a chance to begin. Sarah woke to the sound of his grief, her damaged throat producing a soft sound of distress, and her arms came up around him instinctively, offering comfort to the man who had saved her life, even though he was also the man who had nearly destroyed it. They lay tangled together in the morning light, two broken people beginning the long, painful process of healing, their bond glowing golden between them like a promise that maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the ashes of what had been. The pack gathered in the great hall that evening, summoned by the Alpha's command, and Cade descended the stairs with Sarah at his side, his arm supporting her still weak body, his expression daring anyone to question or challenge her presence. She wore a simple silver dress that made her look ethereal despite the bandages at her throat, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and every eye in the room fixed on her with mixtures of shock, guilt, and growing understanding. Cade led her to the raised platform where the Alpha and Luna thrones sat, and in front of the entire assembled pack, he knelt before her, taking her hand in both of his and pressing it to his forehead in the ancient gesture of submission and claiming. His voice rang out clear and unshakable, declaring her his true mate, his chosen Luna, the other half of his soul, and anyone who refused to accept her would be considered an enemy of the pack and treated accordingly. Sarah looked down at the man kneeling before her, this powerful Alpha King who commanded armies and struck fear into enemies, now humbling himself publicly to honor the bond he had once rejected, and something inside her shifted. The pain didn't disappear, the scars wouldn't heal overnight, the trust had to be rebuilt piece by piece, but in his eyes, she saw sincerity that transcended words, a determination to prove himself worthy that would probably last the rest of their lives. She placed her free hand on his head, her fingers threading through his dark hair, and spoke her first clear words since the hanging tree, her voice rough but steady. She accepted him as her mate, claimed him as her alpha, agreed to stand beside him as Luna, not because she forgave him completely, not because the past 2 years could be erased, but because the bond was real and eternal, and perhaps, with time and effort and genuine remorse, they could transform their tragedy into something worth having. The pack erupted in howls of acceptance, the ancient sound filling the hall and echoing out into the night, and dozens of wolves shifted and ran outside to sing their approval to the moon. Marcus stepped forward and placed the Luna's crown on Sarah's head, a circlet of silver and moonstone that had belonged to Cade's mother and her mother before that, passed down through generations of powerful women who had shaped the pack's destiny. The weight of it was surprising, heavier than it looked, and Sarah understood that it represented responsibility as much as honor, that being Luna meant protecting and leading, not just standing beside the Alpha in pretty dresses. Cade rose and pulled her gently into his arms, mindful of her injuries, and kissed her forehead with reverence that bordered on worship. And for the first time since she had been dragged from her room with murder in mind, Sarah felt something that might eventually become hope. The celebration continued long into the night, but Cade and Sarah slipped away after the formal requirements were met, retreating to their chambers where privacy and healing waited. He helped her undress with careful hands, his eyes cataloging every scar and bruise and rope burn, his expression twisting with pain each time he discovered new evidence of her suffering. She let him care for her, this new tenderness strange but not unwelcome, And when they finally lay down together in the massive bed, she curled into his warmth without hesitation, her body recognizing safety even if her mind still harbored doubts. Cade held her close, his hand stroking patterns on her back, and made promises he intended to keep, vowing to spend every day proving himself, to rebuild what he had destroyed, to create a bond so strong that nothing could ever threaten it again. Weeks passed, and slowly, gradually, the pack house transformed from a place of pain to something approaching home. Cade was relentless in his attention, bringing her breakfast in bed, walking with her through the forest, teaching her pack law and history, introducing her to allies and warriors who would serve as her protection and support. He consulted her on pack decisions, valuing her insight even though she had no formal training, and her perspective as someone who had lived at the bottom of the hierarchy brought wisdom that authority alone couldn't provide. The pack members who had ignored or tormented her during her time as rejected Omega now approached with tentative respect, some offering genuine apologies, others simply adjusting to the new reality where she held ultimate power second only to the Alpha himself. Sarah accepted their submission with grace she didn't entirely feel, understanding that pack dynamics were complex and that many had simply followed Thalia's lead without independent cruelty. The nightmares came frequently, visions of rope and suffocation and Thalia's laughter echoing through darkness. And each time Sarah woke gasping, Cade was there, pulling her against his chest, breathing with her until the panic subsided, his presence an anchor keeping her tethered to the present. He never pushed for physical intimacy beyond holding and gentle touches, understanding that trust required time and safety required proof, and his patience was as healing as any medicine. The bond between them grew stronger daily, golden threads weaving together until they could sense each other's emotions from across the pack house, could communicate wordlessly when words failed, could draw strength from their connection when individual strength ran out. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, and sometimes the weight of past betrayal threatened to crush them both. But they kept fighting, kept choosing each other, kept building something real from foundation up. Spring arrived with shocking suddenness, winter's grip finally releasing its hold, and with the changing season came news that would reshape their world again. Sarah discovered she was pregnant, a tiny life growing inside her that represented hope and future and the ultimate symbol of their completed bond. When she told Cade, he dropped to his knees before her again, his hands coming to rest gently on her still flat stomach. And the joy in his eyes was so pure and overwhelming that Sarah felt her remaining walls crack just a little bit more. He kissed her belly with reverence, whispered promises to their child about protection and love and a pack that would cherish them. And for the first time since the hanging tree, Sarah laughed. The sound surprised and genuine and beautiful. Cade looked up at her with wonder in his expression, and in that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that they were going to make it, that the road ahead would still be difficult, but they would walk it together, that their story, which had begun with rejection and nearly ended with death, would ultimately become one of redemption. The pack celebrated the pregnancy announcement with traditional ceremonies and modern joy combined, and Sarah stood beside Cade as they received congratulations and blessings from pack members who now looked at her with genuine affection. The old healer woman, who had tended Sarah's wounds after the hanging, took her aside and pressed something into her palm, a small pendant carved from moonstone that had belonged to the first Luna of Shadowpine Pack. She told Sarah that true Lunas were forged in fire, that her suffering had not been meaningless, but had prepared her to lead with empathy and strength that untested wolves could never possess, that the pack needed her specific combination of vulnerability and power. The words settled into Sarah's heart like seeds finding soil, and she began to understand that her journey, painful as it had been, had shaped her into exactly the Luna this pack needed, that perhaps the moon goddess had known all along what she was doing, even when the path seemed impossibly cruel. 9 months later, when snow once again covered the forest and the moon hung full and bright above the pack house, Sarah gave birth to a daughter with her father's dark hair and her mother's gentle eyes. Cade held his child with shaking hands, tears streaming down his face as he counted tiny fingers and toes, and when he placed the baby in Sarah's exhausted arms, the circle finally felt complete. They named her Luna, a bold choice that honored tradition while claiming the title Sarah had nearly died for. And as the baby's first cries echoed through the chamber, wolves across the territory howled their welcome to the newest member of the Shadowpine pack. The healer declared the baby perfect and healthy, blessed by the moon goddess with the strength of both parents combined, and predicted she would grow to be a Luna of legendary power who would lead the pack into a golden age. Sarah looked down at her daughter, this tiny miracle who represented everything she had survived to reach, and then up at Cade, who watched them both with expression of such complete devotion that it stole her breath. She had traveled from rejection to acceptance, from death's edge to new life, from broken girl to powerful Luna, and though the scars on her neck still bore witness to the hanging tree, they no longer defined her story. The bond with Cade had transformed from source of pain to wellspring of strength, and their love, hard-won and tested by fire, had become foundation upon which they could build a future worth having. As she drifted towards sleep with her daughter in her arms and her mate's hand clasped in hers, Sarah finally understood that sometimes the most beautiful stories begin with the darkest moments, and that redemption, when truly earned, is sweeter than innocence ever was. Years would pass, and the story of the rejected Omega who became beloved Luna would be told around fires and passed down through generations, a cautionary tale about the cost of denying fate and a love story about second chances and transformation. Sarah would lead alongside Cade with wisdom born from suffering and compassion forged in fire, and their daughter would grow strong and confident in the knowledge that she came from parents who had overcome the impossible. The hanging tree would eventually fall in a storm, the rotten wood finally giving way, and in its place they would plant a new oak, one that symbolized growth and renewal instead of death and judgment. And though the past could never be erased, it could be transformed, woven into a larger story where even the darkest chapters ultimately led to light, where love proved stronger than betrayal, and where the Omega everyone dismissed as worthless became the Luna who saved them all.